Nature fundamentally is that which selects from a genetic perspective. That's nature. That's the fundamental definition of nature. And it is the case that human females are sexually selective. And it's a major component of human behavior. So the evolutionary theory, roughly speaking, is that the reason we diverged from chimpanzees 8 million years ago, 7 million years ago, is at least in part because of the differences between sexual selectivity between female humans and female chimpanzees. Female chimpanzees are more likely to have offspring from dominant males, but it's not because of their sexual selectivity. So a female chimpanzee has periods of fertility that are marked by by observable physiological changes. Not the case with human females. Human female ovulation is concealed. So that's a very profound biological difference between human females and chimpanzees. And the chimpanzee females will mate with any male, but the dominant males chase the subordinate males away. But human females are sexually selective, and it's not a trivial fact. So you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. You think, well, how can that be? Well, imagine that on average, every single human female has had one child throughout the entire course of history, which is approximately correct, by the way. Then imagine that half of the men had 0 and the other half had 2. Okay, and that's roughly the case. So half of males, historically speaking, have been reproductive disasters. And the reason for that is because of female sexual selectivity. So it is actually the case that female humans are nature. It's not only that they're associated with nature symbolically. As far as reproduction is concerned, they are the force of nature that does the selection. And so they're nature in the most fundamental way. And there is a chaotic element of that, at least in relationship to men, and also in relationship to women, because a lot of the female-on-female competition is competition that's chaotic for the right to be sexually selective, right? Not only with regards to men, which drives a lot of politicking, but also in relationship to each other, because part of what human females do is jockey for position in the female dominance hierarchy for the top position, which is the woman who gets to be most sexually selective. And so that drives female-female competition, and it's a different dynamic. There's similarities between female-female competition and male-male competition, but there are also differences, and they're pronounced. So men, for example, men are more likely to compete for socioeconomic status, and that's partly because that drives female mate choice. So the correlation for men between socioeconomic status and sexual success is about 0.6, and for women it's 0. Yeah. 0. In fact, it's actually slightly negative. Yeah. So, and that's a huge difference between men and women.
But do you know the anthropologist Sarah Hrdy? H-R-D-Y. And she's like my favorite feminist theorist, although as she would say, I'm a theorist who happens to be a feminist, but she studied primate behavior, and she looked at the women the females in women very carefully, and looked at chimpanzees and gazelles, and found that the female, initially, like male primatologists would look and say, oh, the males are dominant and the females are so cooperative. She looked more carefully and saw the females weren't exactly cooperative. Like they would pass around their infant, their baby, whatever they were, and would find, and so the male primatologists would say, oh, they're so kind and caring. She found out that when it was not hers, they would take like little tufts of hair, would come out, or they'd do something to the eyes, and the baby would like be injured, and she saw all this violence.
Especially true when there's status differentiation.
Yes.
So it's much more likely that'll happen when a higher status female is taking care of a lower status infant.
Exactly, and she said the great tragedy, well, not tragedy, she said the reality of our species. And in fact, the subtitle for the book is the woman who never evolved. We didn't evolve for niceness and cooperative. There's immense competition, and we can, according to her, it's indelibly, marked in our nature to compete for the dominant males.
Oh,
and
yes, no doubt about that.
And
that seems true cross-culturally as well. That does flatten out a little bit in the more egalitarian societies. Yeah. So instead of being exaggerated, it does flatten to some degree.
Right.
So you could imagine that There's a biological component and a cultural component.
Of course,
and
both.
In that case, if you modify the cultural component, then that seems to decrease the overall. So, like, let me be more clear about this. Women are less prone to mate up, across and up status hierarchies in Scandinavia than they are in less egalitarian countries, but they're still prone to do it. So worldwide, for example, young women find men who are about 4 years older than them maximally attractive. And they tend to mate across and up status hierarchies. And so one of the consequences of that, for example, is that as women have entered the workforce, they've actually driven inequality, because rich women will only marry rich men as rich as them or richer, whereas rich men will marry women who are poorer than them, but women won't. And so what that means is it's another factor that's pooling wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
It's a sortative mating now, and you just find someone with your background. Whereas a doctor might have once married his secretary, he now marries another doctor.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask then, stepping a little bit back from primates as well, how does this selection work in the era of swiping right and left? What is your reaction to the way young people date today?
Oh, that's a good. I was really hoping we'd get into that. I was really.
Well, you were very into the monkeys, so I didn't want to interrupt.
No. Well, I should close off the Scandinavian discussion just by pointing out, and this is something that the Scandinavians are really going to have to wrestle with, is that if you institute effective policies to promote equality of opportunity, which the Scandinavians have done, you're going to produce some equality, so like a 50-50 distribution of men and women in the workplace, but you're also going to exacerbate certain kinds of inequality, and you can't get out of that. So you cannot have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome together. They don't work together. And equality of outcome, the essential equality of outcome doctrine, which is often described with the code word equity, is that at every level of every occupation, the people have to be represented by the same number that they're represented in at the population. So if it's not 50-50 men and women in each occupation and in each strata at each occupation, then that's sort of prima facie evidence for discrimination and for systemic discrimination. It's like, nope, sorry, you have to factor in choice, and choice actually turns out to be a very important determinant. And as the society gets flatter and flatter, choice becomes a more and more important determinant. And so what that essentially means is that the most radical end of the left-wing political agenda is logically impossible, apart from the fact that it's impossible for a variety of other reasons.
And they should look at the data. I mean, it's just a cliche now of, in any group of activists, and they'll say, oh, well, we need, in order for women to achieve equality, we need government-funded daycare, and we need, they have it in Sweden.
Yeah.
Sweden has fewer women in managerial levels. American women are ahead. In fact, now they have quotas over there, so they need female CEOs and females on board.
But it hasn't made any difference.
They're bringing in American women because we're so much further ahead.
Yeah.
So
it's made no difference in the distribution of men and women lower in the hierarchy.
No, it's called the Nordic paradox.
Yeah.
And
okay, you guys are so wonky. I want to get back to
Okay, so yes, that's good.
I think we all want to get back to data.
I want to get back to these monkeys.
I was thinking this morning about, I was talking to a variety of political types, and we were talking about...
this morning?
Yeah.
In D.C.?
Hard to believe.
Who?
Hard to believe. No, I'm not telling you.
Okay.
A bunch of Republicans here, and I've been talking to Democrats as well, but it was mostly Republicans here. And we were talking about abortion, and I made a case that that's really not a very productive discussion, because you're talking about a problem way too late in the sequence of problems. So by the time the discussion starts to be about abortion, there's 50 problems that have already emerged that no one has addressed. And some of those problems are, the fundamental problem is how human beings should regulate their sexual behavior. And that's a big problem. And you think, well, and there's an interesting thing that's happening, because the people on the right would say, well, that's easy. It's like, don't sleep around and get married and have sex with your marital partner, and that'll solve the problem. So there's strictures on sexual behavior, and those would be the traditional ones. And what you see on the left is that there's this weird paradoxical demand, let's say, that people should be allowed to express their sexuality in any manner that they choose, whenever they want, but that sex is so dangerous that it has to be carefully regulated at every single stage of the interaction. And so you know that many state legislatures have now followed the example of university campuses and put it in affirmative consent legislation, so that every move you make towards physical intimacy has to be preceded by the instantiation of a verbal contract, essentially. It's like, well, can I take your hand? Yes. You actually, from what I understand, you actually have to say yes. Like, nodding is not sufficient. And so each stage has to be preceded by affirmative consent. And you know, which well, I won't say anything about, yeah, I will. It's absurd. It's absurd to assume that that's how human intimate relationships are supposed to proceed. And then you have complicated laws emerging that are part of that, that, for example, this is the case in California, as I understand it, is that you cannot give affirmative consent if you're intoxicated. Okay, so you think about that. It's like, well, what does that mean?
It means that, like, a lot of sex
Is illegal.
has been illegal for a long time,
Yes.
including
Marital. Yes,
including,
that's what it seems
like,
to mean.
on my honeymoon. Okay,
Well, that is.
I'm rethinking it.
It seems.
I'm rethinking it.
It seems to me. It seems to mean, and you know, it seems to me to mean the California legislation that if you have sex with your wife or husband and either of you is intoxicated, then you're either one of you or both is guilty of rape. That's what it looks like to me.
Actually, I was in a debate a few years ago at the University of Virginia Law School, and I turned to my debate partner and said, so if what you're saying is right, two people can rape one another.
Right.
She said, yes. And I thought, oh, shit. I mean, like, I mean, how can that be?
Well, that's the question. Well, okay, so then I would say, well, it's interesting because I think that a lot of this confusion has emerged fundamentally as a consequence of the birth control pill. So, you know, because you got to think situationally before you think ideologically or psychologically. It's like, it seems to me that the 20th century will be remembered for the hydrogen bomb, the transistor, and the birth control pill. And those are unbelievably radical technological innovations. And maybe
Internet came in.
Yeah, but
My
it's
Fair Lady,
dependent on
My
the,
Fair Lady. Just saying.
It's dependent on the transistor, you know, because it
okay,
spawned
yes,
all
okay,
of that.
okay.
So that's the big technological innovation that spawned all that. And of the three, I would say the birth control pill is probably the bigger hydrogen bomb. So, and because it changed the fundamental biological nature of women and men. And because it gave women, for the first time in biological history, the option of choosing their reproductive status.
Yeah.
And that's
We like that.
That's well, yes and no. Like, yes, we like it. But it's
did.
not something that's come without a tremendous, it's
Have you
come
been
with
reading
tremendous
Lionel
complexity.
Tiger? A fellow Canadian. Have you been reading Lionel
No,
Tiger?
no, I
I
haven't.
think you'll find him interesting because he writes about that.
Well, and I'm not making a case for the abolition of the birth control pill by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pointing at its complexity. And so, because one of the questions is, well, once you can regulate your reproductive function, what attitude should you have towards sex? And one answer might be, the more of it under the more varied circumstances, the better, because why not? And I would say that was actually part of the attitude that emerged in the aftermath of the birth control pill in the 1960s, right? And it was a reasonable response in some sense because it's such a cataclysmic change that you don't know what it implies. Well, what's the consequence of that? Well, first of all, people aren't reliable enough to use birth control in an entirely reliable manner. So even though it can work at near 100% efficiency, you have to take it extraordinarily regularly and in a disciplined manner for that to work. And so there was still the problem of unwanted pregnancy, let's say. And then there was the problem of the proliferation of sexual epidemics, and that culminated in AIDS, which, you know, could have easily wiped all of us out, but didn't. But there's other sexual epidemics that could have had the same effect, but we've been fortunate enough to escape them. And then more recently, there's been this weird inversion, especially on the radical left, that points to the reemergence of something like a set of sexual taboos. Like I think the idea that sex is casual and that it's a form of entertainment I think it's an absolutely preposterous idea. I think that it's psychologically shallow beyond belief to hold that as a core proposition, because it forces you to, first of all, if it's repetitive sex with multiple partners, it forces you to treat people as if they're interchangeable. And I don't see how that's good for you psychologically or for the people that you're using interchangeably. It implies that you can divorce sexuality from play, from the desire for a relationship, from emotional fragility, from love, from family, from responsibility, all of those things that are part and parcel of everyone, and I don't think you can, and I don't think people's experience indicates that you can, and especially on the emotional front. And I think that's partly what's driving. And there's also a residual sense that there's something about sex that's fundamentally dangerous, and maybe it's dangerous emotionally and personally, and maybe it's dangerous socially and psychologically, which it most certainly is, because it's a powerful force. And the way the left is reacting to that is by insisting that all forms of sexual behavior are valid and that it's reasonable to manifest all of them, but that it's simultaneously so dangerous that absolutely every aspect of it has to be state regulated and in an increasingly draconian form. And so I think what needs to happen is that the left and the right have to get together and have a real discussion about what constitutes valid sexual morality. And that's the conversation you have to have way before you worry about solving the abortion debate, which is very divisive and very intractable.
Well, one of the things we talked about actually just last week on the podcast is this cover story in The Atlantic about the sexual recession amongst young people, that despite the advent of the birth control pill, abortion is going down.
But there's
less sex.
There's
Everything
less
is going down.
fewer hookups.
And have you
can't
looked
help but
into that? Do you
worry
have an
about that.
opinion on that?
Well, if you raise the cost of something, you decrease its prevalence. And I think that it seems to be,
Dangerous now to hook up.
Well,
you don't know what'll happen.
I kind of think that it's also a reflection of the same thing that Bloomberg reported on just a few days ago. They said that across businesses, men are thinking, I'm not spending any time with a single woman that isn't, associated with me in some formal manner, like my wife. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to mentor young women. I'm not going to be in a room alone with them.
Because I could face career annihilation.
Absolutely, and instantly.
They're frightened of young women now.
But as Kate Julian said, that's part of it. But we can over-exaggerate the part. I mean, anxiety and depression is going up amongst both young men and young women. Suicide is going up. It's not just a, most people I think are not. We're talking about an elite demographic who is into the consent and political correctness and workplace. This is across the board, and it's global. It's happening even in Sweden.
It's really happening in Japan.
Yeah, and Japan, exactly. So
Weird things are
and that
happening in
speaks
Japan.
to, and especially in Japan, they have people, especially young men, have given up on intimacy, and that having sex is actually,
But have
too
they
much
given
trouble.
up on the sex robots?
Right.
No.
Well, right. Well,
The
that's
Hello
the
Kitty
question.
robots.
Well, and there's pornography.
Yeah,
There's
lots of
pornography.
pornography.
And
Basically zero risk
But even
sexual
when
behavior.
you allow for pornography, that men and women will sort of separate that from their actual sex life. Anyway, we're seeing a whole, I guess, collapse of intimacy, let alone sex. And I don't think that's just explained by the political nature. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I don't know the literature on the decline in sexual activity well enough to know if it's valid or reliable. But I think that in a stable society, you take lots of things for granted. You take the fact that men and women are going to be sexually attracted to one another for granted. And even though it's more fragile than it appears, it's suppressed more easily than you might think. And you take the idea that men and women are going to move together towards the establishment of long-term intimate relationships for granted. But that's partly because you don't understand what invisible preconditions exist to make that self-evident. you know, and when those invisible preconditions are disrupted by rapid technological or sociological change, then things shift underneath you and you don't know why. Like,
A lot of it is traced to the advent of the smartphone, especially in the Generation Z. That Kate was explaining this to us, that you could see it was broadband internet and the smartphone that led to this, you know, increasing fall off of relationships.
yeah, well, maybe the abstract is more interesting than
Right,
the proximal.
like-
You see that
Kate,
when you're having dinner with people.
I want to know the truth. Have you ever been with somebody you loved and found fascinating and all that, but you really wanted to get back to your smartphone? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, well, it happens all the time.
It happens to me.
Yeah,
She'll never
Christina,
admit it.
No,
Yeah.
it happens during our podcast. To tell you to put your phone down.
No, I'm researching
Well, they're
things
very-
for the
they're very
purpose of the
addictive.
podcast.
They're very addictive.
Yeah, they're very addictive.
let me-
And you know, I read the other day that the
They're
preferred,
very alluring.
they are.
We're kind of going together.
The preferred method of interpersonal communication between young people now is texting rather than face-to-face communication.
Right, and the swiping, the apes don't
Well,
swipe.
that's a very interesting topic too. The like the Tinder phenomenon. That's
Right.
because that's also a major technological revolution, because what it's done, I would say, for the first time, is reduce the cost of rejection to males to zero, because it hides it. The only people you ever hear from are people who haven't rejected you.
Although true, but there was one man who had to make 300, he actually tallied it.
Yeah.
He had to make 300 requests of swiping right or whatever
To
for one
yield
reply.
one.
So
Right,
I think he
right.
had the sense of rejection.
Sure, but it's massively attenuated.
Yeah.
And
You know,
it's
because-
not observed.
Yeah, you're not being humiliated.
Not at
Right,
all.
right.
Not at all. It's really,
Right.
it's really at arm's length, and you know you can
Right.
swipe very, very rapidly, and so you can get all that rejection over with in a very short period of
Right,
time.
it's like losing a video game or something. You go on to the
or
next-
well, less because
Worse. Not nearly as bad.
yeah.
So, and you know, I don't know what, and I mean, Tinder also reduces the. One of the other things that you want to think about with regards to sex, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost of sex to fall to zero? Because with pornography certainly does that, and it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever sex is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price. And so that's, you know,
Well,
I've
you can
heard
go to the
from,
bunny ranch and pay quite a bit for it.
well, true, but that's true, but you know, you don't have to. And,
No.
you know, I've heard from a number of women, read blog reports on their frustration with their attempts to be relatively sexually selective. Like, let's say they decide that they're not going to sleep with their new partner on the first date. You know, they're frustrated by the fact that to the degree that they're being cautious in their sexual behavior, which I think is actually an admirable idea, that they're instantly outcompeted, especially if their partners are somewhat impulsive, by women who will say yes at the drop of a hat. And so, well, again, I don't think, you know, it depends on what the goal is. That's the thing, is that there's short-term sexual gratification, but the literature indicates that married couples, for example, or couples in a permanent